A couple of words to begin. First, I have to express my profound thanks to the Ontario Trillium Foundation. Ontario Trillium Foundation has been supporting several of the key programs at Royal Botanical Gardens, and this lecture is part of a whole series of events this year and next that we have under an overall umbrella that we're calling informally Heritage and Heroes. I would like to acknowledge the long history of First Nations and Métis people in the province of Ontario, and pay special respects this morning to the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation and to the Six Nations of the Grand River Territory. We're meeting today on the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Huron-Wendat peoples. So my theme today is what's called landscape, or coming out of that, what we experience as people as a sense of place. So here's an example of a landscape. This is Royal Botanical Gardens Center down here. The core of the building opened way back in 1958 and various additions over the years. Across Plains Road West in Burlington, of course, the area that's called the Henry Park Gardens, including, this is an older photograph, the Rose Garden area, Kippax Garden, Scented Garden, and a variety of other things. So landscape is all about place. It's all about the actual unfolding of structures, natural history, plants, animals, people on the land. This is about building stories that we can connect to physically. Landscape and heritage, for me, heritage isn't just about something that's old and dusty. It's about whether or not we can tell exciting stories today about what's gone on in the past based on what we see in front of us. So the idea of this talk is to look at some of the landscapes that Royal Botanical Gardens owns and stewards and ask some of these questions. How did they get to be the way they are today? But sometimes that seems a little bit abstract, so I wanted to start off with something a little more concrete. This is a little pebble. I'm holding the same thing that you're seeing on the photograph. It's exactly the same little object. So let's take a look at our little black rock again. We had one suggestion of obsidian. Does anybody else have any ideas of the material? It's kind of rough. It's smooth but irregular. Coal. Coal, very good. Anthracite coal. Okay, so it's hard coal, it's not charcoal. That's great. Now, I'll give you a second clue as to the story behind this little pebble. I found it walking on a beach along one of the Great Lakes. So how would anthracite coal get onto a beach along the Great Lakes? A ship. Yes, exactly right. And it's smoothed because it's been sitting in sand on a beach for years and years and years. Second or third or fourth clue, I found this south of the town of Kincardine, Ontario. Now, again, I don't know if anybody knows that area very well, but there's a geographic reference there to a shipwreck called Boiler Beach. And this is actually some of the fuel that was on board this ship in 1883 when it blew up south of Kincardine. This was the Erie Bell. There's now a seafood restaurant in Kincardine named the Erie Bell. This is the actual Erie Bell. A little tugboat that had about 20 years of service on the Great Lakes, and it was a steamship. It had a reciprocating steam engine in it. It's about 112 feet long, and in November of 1883, it was trying to rescue another ship, a schooner that had blown ashore south of Kincardine called the J.N. Carter. And so this ship was called up from Goderich. They got offshore south of Kincardine, and this ship had a history. And the history was that the engineer liked pushing his luck. And he ran the engine, he ran the boiler at a high pressure. And it went kablooey on the 21st of November, 1883. And 4 of the 12-man crew were killed when the ship exploded. It was blown into several big parts. The parts were later pulled ashore and scavenged. So there's no shipwreck there to see really. Except again, if you've been in an area, you might have seen this. This is the actual ship's boiler from the Erie Bell, which now sits on shore south of Kincardine a couple of miles. It's hard to figure out from this direction what you're seeing, but you're actually looking at the side of the boiler, and the front of the ship would be down. And so this big box is the furnace into which coal would have been shoveled by the stoker to burn and create heat, and the heat would heat up water in a jacket around that furnace, and these are steam tubes. So the steam would accumulate in these tubes and then be pushed out through a valve into the reciprocating steam engine to make the ship go. So if you have a physical bit of evidence of an event, and you can link it to landscape, you can start telling some really intriguing stories, but it's always a combination of historical documentation and what you see in front of you. So I have sometimes in my pocket a little piece of a shipwreck. Not just an anonymous shipwreck, something I can tell a story about. Now the lovely thing about landscape is it's like that. It's like a big artifact. It's hard to think of a bigger artifact, in fact, than landscape. But the landscape that we see around us is very much a product of natural processes, biological processes, and human activity. And what's wonderful is that if we have the documentation, we can peel back some of those ideas, some of those things, and start telling stories about what we see. Now, I've used the term cultural landscape, and it owes its origins to Carl Sauer, who was a geographer in the US in the early 20th century, and he promoted this idea of the cultural landscape. So a cultural landscape is an area in which natural features have been replaced or modified by human activity, sometimes over and over and over. One culture comes in and changes the landscape, another culture may come in and completely modify the landscape again, or leave parts of what they found behind. And since his work 90 years ago, the field of cultural geography has really expanded. And people have gotten away from the idea of thinking of landscape simply in terms of big monuments. Not just big monuments, but the totality of the thing that you see in front of you. How it got there as a landform. The hydrology is important, where the water is going and what it's doing. Vegetation, visible structures, and even informed by things like archaeology and historical documents. And these kinds of thinkings about landscape can take place at different scales. You could go from the area of your backyard up to the area of all of southern Ontario and consider it a landscape if you wanted to. There's many different ways of considering these spaces, and so I'm not saying there's one way to look at a landscape and interpret history, but I am suggesting that it's one of the strongest things we can do to connect ourselves to a place and by extension to a community. Because most communities until the age of the internet were based in place. We're based in the local area. And there's all sorts of fun ways to get involved with this. Just walking around and taking notes and looking and asking, well, what is that over there? Or what is this over here? Or why is it here? That's the important question, isn't it? You were always, the 3-year-old was always asked why. Why is it there? And what is its meaning? Royal Botanical Gardens itself is a fascinating place, and it's just been an amazing revelation to me to be there now, as long as I have. Because every time I turn around, we're finding out something new about this place, about this landscape. Not just from the archaeological record, but even from things like archives. Royal Botanical Gardens is the 6th largest institution on the basis of its land in North America that calls itself a botanical garden or an arboretum. We have about 2,700 acres of property. That's about 1,100 hectares, or 11 square kilometers of land. And again, I'm hoping most of you are generally familiar with where we are. The green area is our nature sanctuary properties. We're down here. Sorry, wait a minute. There's McMaster's main campus. Main Street, so we're down here somewhere. But all of the south shore of Cootes Paradise Marsh, the north shore, sections of the Niagara Escarpment, some of the intervening lands, and the areas to the east in Henry Valley and along the Burlington Heights are all part of our property. And it's those nature sanctuaries that really make us interesting, I think. We're wonderful in terms of gardens, but to actually be a steward of so much natural land is a real unique feature and a challenge. But it means we're always thinking about this connection between nature and the built environment in all sorts of interesting and all sorts of practical ways. Today I wanted to zero in on one area, because I could talk for weeks and weeks and weeks about all of this. I want to talk about the Burlington Heights. This is a peninsula that runs between Dundurn Castle and the Rock Garden. For local geography, this is a stretch of land called the Burlington Heights. It's part of a larger landform called the Iroquois Bar. And that runs from down here in Locke Street. There's a raise of land, you know that hill in Locke Street? It's the same feature. It runs through Hamilton, along the edge of the harbor in Hood's Paradise, and it continues into Burlington, and Royal Botanical Gardens Center is sitting on the same structure. So it's not something that's only restricted to there, it's part of a larger gravel barn. Now the Burlington Heights is probably, I haven't checked this for sure, but it's one of the densest places I've ever encountered in terms of history, historical markers. We drive through it on Plains Road as fast as we can, or on York Boulevard. We're up and down on the 403 and we don't pay attention to the landscape and what's there. It's amazing. Everything from Dundurn Castle down at the bottom, that was the home of Allan Napier McNabb, constructed in the 1830s. Of course, before that, in the 1790s, it was the home of Richard Beasley. And it was Beasley's property that the British military commandeered in late May of 1813, when they'd been booted out of Niagara. And they marched up here, they sat down at Richard Beasley's farm, they took it over, and 6 days later, they marched back to Stony Creek and they attacked and defeated the Americans at the Battle of Stony Creek. That attack was launched from that site. So there's several things on the Burlington Heights that commemorate the War of 1812. In Hamilton Cemetery, across the street from Dundurn Castle, there are remains of earthworks that the British threw up as a line of defense, because the Burlington Heights was recognized early on as a defensible natural fortress. It rises over 100 feet up off of the surrounding territory with steep walls. It's a perfect natural fort. And there's, if you walk the length or if you out, there's also a marker here right by the big bridge, marking the second line of defense that the British threw up to protect the Burlington Heights, because further up the peninsula in the War of 1812, they built barracks and they built a magazine up there. So all kinds of stuff going on in the Burlington Heights. One of the sites I'll specifically mention is the cholera graves site, number 6 here, which is a very evocative and lonely place where people were buried starting during the War of 1812 and right through the ship immigration issues in the 1840s and 1850s possibly, because people were coming to North America, especially from Ireland during the famine, and many of them were ill, and a lot of them died. And there are spaces there, places there where there are probably Irish immigrants buried there, also down in Burlington Cemetery, or Hamilton Cemetery. And one of the speakers we have tomorrow is a historian who has just spent 2 years researching the history of those Irish immigrants and what happened to them, and even where their graves are today. And so she's going to be one of our speakers tomorrow. It should be a great talk. The history of this landform, and I want to get right into contemporary history, but it is important to think about where it came from. This is a picture of Hamilton 14,000 years ago. There's Hamilton, and that's ice, to scale. So we have an awful lot to thank the Wisconsin and glaciation for in terms of the land around us. By about 13,000 years ago, the glacier had retreated, and where we have Lake Ontario today, we have something that the archaeologists and geographers call Lake Iroquois. It was much, much bigger than Lake Ontario. In fact, the water level, if you imagine where the Burlington Heights is and the big bridge with the pointy things, the Thomas Baker McQuestion Memorial Bridge, that was the level of the lake 13,000 years ago, because that Burlington Heights is a beach strip. It's geologically exactly the same as the Hamilton Harbor beach strip. It's the same idea. It's sand and gravel that got washed up against a shallow bay. Well, the Burlington Heights, 13,000 years ago, was the mouth to this large bay where Cootes Paradise Marsh and the town of Dundas now sit. The town of Dundas was under 100 feet of water at this time. And the geologists tell us that possibly in the period of a day, that water level dropped 300 feet. It's thought that there was an ice dam at the far end of the lake, and it probably gave way, and the water just went kablooey out. And suddenly we've got a ridge of sand and gravel sticking up, and all this other terrain exposed. So as you can tell, I like talking about time as well as space, because I'm a Doctor Who fanatic. And it's, I think, also helpful to think about the sweep of time as we look at these kinds of questions about where the landscape came from, because land persists for generations until it gets changed. So here's a very quick timeline. every block is 1,000 years along this timeline. So 12,000, 13,000 years ago, we had Lake Iroquois opening up and the water level dropping. Archaeologists have divided time up into several periods in North America. The early Archaic is when we start seeing the first evidence of human activity in this area. That photograph is actually a photograph of a little projectile point that was found at Princess Point about 10 years ago, and it's dated to between 8,000 and 9,000 years ago. This is not unusual for Ontario. There are archaeological sites all over the place with dates ranging from 8,000 to 10,000 years ago and earlier. And yet we don't see about it, we don't necessarily think about it, but that's how long people have been here. Our next sign of habitation several thousand years later is another projectile point from the late Archaic found at Sassafras Point, another sort of a spear point if you like. As we zoom in, we start seeing when Europeans started arriving, like the majority of us in the room. Again, archaeologists have sliced up time into different segments in Ontario based on what they find in the archaeological record, what it appears people have been doing. And it's only in these last 300 years that we call the historical period that we can start talking about most of what we see around us for a couple of reasons. One is that we have done so much to change and alter the landscape in the last 200 years here especially. One of the central people in the history of the Mississaugas and the New Credit was born on the Burlington Heights in 1802. His name was Peter Jones, and he was the son of the daughter of the Mississauga chief and an American loyalist fleeing the Revolutionary War named Augustus Jones. Now if you're in downtown Stony Creek, there is a statue to Augustus Jones. The life-sized bronze guy with an eagle sitting nearby is this man's father. Peter, again, I haven't got time to go into his history, but he became literate at an early age. He became a Methodist minister, first Indigenous person to be ordained as a minister in Ontario. And this photograph is fascinating. It's dated 1845. It's a photograph. Now, if you understand the history of photography, that's early. In fact, this is the earliest known photograph of any North American Indigenous person from anywhere. Because he and his wife, who is English, traveled to England 3 times to argue that they should have, his community should have the rights to the land that they were occupying, and they didn't get it. But also to raise funds for their missionary work. And he was in Edinburgh, Scotland, and he and his wife had portraits taken at an early photography studio. Now the land that we see today is not necessarily what was there hundreds or even thousands of years ago. This is a great spot. This is Princess Point, right on Cootes Paradise Marsh. And Princess Point is where there has been fantastic archaeological work done. We'll hear about that tomorrow if you come to the symposium. But what you don't see in a picture like this is how artificial that landscape is. You're looking at a surface that consists of 1.5 meters of fill that was added about a century ago to the peninsula. So sometime around 1915, 1925, somebody decided that Princess Point had to be covered with landfill. And it's clean sand and pebbles and rocks. It looks like it's from a riverbed. But the surface you actually walk on is actually relatively recent. You have to go down 1 or 2 meters to find the archaeology. It's amazing to think about a sense of place when you're walking at some place like Princess Point. 1 meter or 2 meters below the surface you're walking on, there are things like this. Now again, this doesn't look like too much. It looks like something that fell off of someone's boot, a bit of mud. But that's actually a fragment of a pot that was created 1,500 years ago by someone in what's now called the Princess Point culture. They were very skilled potters, and they decorated the pots they made with this incised pattern made by wrapping some reeds around a stick and then laying the stick into the pot. This is a wonderful community to think about also because they're, in terms of archaeology, the first people known in the northeast of North America to practice agriculture. There's evidence of maize kernels coming out of Princess Point. And now that's a botanical garden. It's amazing. There's other evidence of the history of Indigenous people in the landscape which is worth thinking about if you're ever out walking on a trail. And I can't speak again for my friend Paul O'Hara here too much. It's his story to tell. But a fascinating thing that's come forward in the past 20 years or so is that there are still trees on trails and in natural areas in southern Ontario which were made centuries ago as trail markers. by indigenous people. If you ever see a tree that comes out of the ground and does a right angle bend, and then goes up again a few feet later, and it's old, it's almost certainly a marker tree. They were made by taking a small sapling and bending it over and staking it for a few years so it gets a right angle bend, and then chopping off all of the branches except the ones sticking up. So that's a very characteristic shape of these marker trees, and they're found all over eastern North America. The Europeans arrived in our area in the 1870s. Richard Beasley was one of the first settlers that's known to have actually put down roots here. And of course the Burlington Heights, as I've said, became very important during the War of 1812. There are only a couple of maps of the Burlington Heights at the time. This is a quite accurate one, drawn in 1813. And now, of course, today the big famous feature for Royal Botanical Gardens is the Rock Garden at the northern tip of the Burlington Heights. So on a couple of these maps, I've got these little circles. That's where the Rock Garden is today. The area's been depicted since the late 1700s by artists as well. Elizabeth Simcoe was the wife of Lieutenant Governor John Graves Simcoe. Footnote, she was never Lady. If you hear Lady Simcoe, that's the name of a pub. Her husband was not Lord Simcoe. But Mrs. Elizabeth Simcoe traveled the countryside and in 1897 stayed at Richard Beasley's house and painted landscape paintings of Cootes Paradise Marsh and Hamilton Harbor. As we go forward in time, we start seeing other maps and we start seeing evidence of the things we can see on the Burlington Heights today, like that soldier's graveyard and the graveyard of the Irish immigrants. In 1834, for example, there actually was a map of the Burlington Heights drawn that shows the old barracks on the northern end of the Burlington Heights and the soldier's graveyard. Now, what's interesting about this site, and I don't know if you know it, but if you ever go up to the Burlington Heights and walk around, you can get off on the southbound side of York Boulevard, and there's a little lay-by, and you can take a walk down to this site. We have no idea what's actually under the ground. None. There are no documents, there's no number of graves, there's no names for them. There is a plaque that was applied in 1926, which reads, "Guard this resting place of these unknown soldiers, immigrants, and citizens, War of 1812 to 1814, Ship Fever 1847 to 48, and of course that's the Irish immigration, and Cholera 1854, 1855. There should be another line, because there was a horrifying outbreak of cholera in Hamilton between 1833 and 1834. And about 150 people died during that outbreak in a tiny little town called Hamilton, and they were buried there. As far as we know, they were buried on the Burlington Heights. Now, one of the reasons why people settle where they do is that natural resources are present. People don't just plunk down towns at random. They go where there's stuff to get. And early in the 19th century, people were recognizing things like Cootes Paradise Marsh as critical natural resources. John McTaggart was actually a Scottish engineer who published a 2-volume book in 1826-27, and he sadly died in 1828. But he visited all kinds of places in British North America and wrote up essentially an inventory of natural resources and development opportunities. And he recognized Cootes Paradise Marsh as, quote, strongly recommended to ornithologists and sportsmen as a place above all others yet known in Canada, most deserving of attention if you're interested in things like wildlife. He also went on to write that the marsh should be immediately drained and turned into a farm. But he said it would surpass in productivity any other farm in the country. Of course, many people are aware of the Desjardins Canal, the canal that runs from Dundas to Hamilton Harbor, the first large-scale modification of the landscape in our immediate area. The canal itself has a long and amazing history, which I can only briefly touch on. Originally, the canal started actually as Spencer Creek, as a modification of Spencer Creek coming out of Dundas, and it was dug out as a ditch in the 1820s, 12 feet wide and 3 feet deep. And that might not sound very much, but it's enough for bateaux to move in and out. And in the early 1820s, that's what the merchants needed, just get the little boats in and out. After that, they started working on ships. When the canal was opened in the mid-1830s, it ran from Dundas right through Cootes Paradise Marsh, and then up over the northern part of the Burlington Heights and out into Hamilton Harbor, because the Burlington Heights were a formidable barrier. And there are some wonderful aerial photographs that show evidence of the canal that we can't see anymore. This is one from the 1930s that shows here the Burlington Heights and some of the bridges going across the gap that I'll explain in a second. And here's the canal. Vegetation on either side of it, a lot of it is aquatic emergent vegetation that was destroyed later in the 20th century. And sometimes you can still see evidence of the canal itself during low water events in the wintertime. Here is a pillar from the wall of the canal, visible, you can just walk up to it and take a look at it in the wintertime. These are dotted all the way along the length of the canal, from the Coos Paradise Fishwife area in toward Dundas. Now most of these now are gradually eroding, and some of them occasionally pop out of the water, like a tooth being pulled out, these pop out. There's one mounted on the wall in our Nature Interpretive Center at RBG, and it's a piece of oak, 24 inches wide by 24 inches wide by 8 feet long. And this is what they built the entire canal out of. Again, imagine the forest that came down to build that structure. I'm also interested in the canal for another reason, and I keep dropping hints to some of my friends. I think it's actually an enormous marine archaeology site that's never been examined. Nobody's ever looked at it as an archaeological site. The railroads started coming into the area in the 1850s, and that changed the Burlington Heights forever. One of the things they did was to insist that there be a gap in the Burlington Heights to reroute the canal, because they wanted to build causeways up here for the railroad tracks. So in the 1850s, a huge project was undertaken involving both the canal company, and it was a company, it was private industry, it was not government, and the railway companies. And they actually dug a gap right through the Burlington Heights, and that's why we have that bridge with the 4 spires on it today. Because the canal, they wanted to straighten the canal. Around 1897, they had to tear down the second of the bridges across that big gap, and somebody had the great, wonderful sense to take a photograph or two of the site. So this is what the Burlington Heights actually looks like under the ground. It's layers and layers and layers of compacted sand and gravel. There's no stone up there at all. At the time, the top of the Burlington Heights was covered with small houses, telegraph wires, all kinds of things. And it became a cause, at a causeway, it became a cause in the early 20th century for the city founders in Hamilton who wanted to make Hamilton the greatest place in Canada. In many ways, Hamilton was in direct competition with Toronto and Montreal by this time. The waterworks, again, if you haven't been up to the Steam Museum, you must get there. That steam installation from the 1880s was world-leading when it was built in Hamilton. All sorts of evidence of their trying to make Hamilton then the ambitious city. If you see the use of that catchphrase today for Hamilton, it's not new. It's 100 years old. And the city of Hamilton hired this lovely looking gentleman, Nolan Couchon from Ottawa, a railway engineer, to prepare a report about the features of Hamilton most worthy of aggrandizement, development, and so on. He delivered that in October of 1817, and there's one copy I found so far in the local history archives in the city library in downtown Hamilton. He said there were 3 places in Hamilton, 3 geographical features most worthy of attention. Hamilton Mountain, the Niagara Escarpment itself, the Hamilton Beach Strip, because at the time it wasn't covered with houses and things the way it is now, it was more like a park, and the Burlington Heights. His report's about 100 pages long and includes all sorts of recommendations about developing a university and other facilities. It took the city a while to actually act on it. By 1826, they bought up the Burlington Heights. In 1828, the Board of Park Management, led by our hero at RBG, Thomas Baker McQuestion, our founder, reached out and started working on how to improve the Burlington Heights. What can you do with this mess of small buildings and billboards and gravel pits? Because there were gravel pits all over the Burlington Heights. And they put out a call for landscape architects to develop a plan to cover the top of the Burlington Heights with gardens, and with museums, and with restaurants, and with gas stations, which were all the rage because, of course, cars were taking over. They gave all the competitors, all the architects, a big blueprint of the Burlington Heights, and we have 2 of these in our archives. One of them is in Ottawa right now being restored at the Canadian Conservation Institute. And this blueprint intriguingly shows this round feature as quote-unquote gravel pit. So it's a 5.5 acre circle, 30 feet deep, and that's where the rock garden is today. There were 12 architects that made submissions for the creation of this monumental entrance garden to Hamilton. Because again, think about your own homes. You know what curb value means? This was curb value for Hamilton, because what is now called York Boulevard was Highway 2, the road from Toronto to Hamilton. And of course, anyone who's important is coming from Toronto, right? You want to impress them. And unfortunately, that long drive by the 1920s was a mess. The landscape was not pretty at all. That's why they got going on this project. They also had to replace that bridge on the gap. They had 12 finalists, 3 of whom were selected as runners-up or the winner. This is a very famous illustration that we have in our archives, the original. This is one of the 3 finalists, done by a drawing of the bridge done by an architect named John Lyell. Lyell lived in Hamilton for a while. He was working out of Toronto by the 1920s. He's also very well known for designing Toronto's Union Station. That was another one of his big projects. I think he was looking 90 years in the future and smoking grass when he designed this, because it could not have been built this way at all. For example, underneath here, there are 3 different railway bridges crossing diagonally over that canal. He just ignored them to make a spectacular drawing and draw attention to himself. But it worked. He didn't win the competition, but he was awarded the contract to design the real bridge. And so that bridge that we see now on York Boulevard, beautiful steel span with the 4 limestone pillars, was designed by John Lyell. And there's, again, an amazing history about that bridge, which I haven't got time to get into. But it's a huge landmark. It's in stylized form the logo of the city of Hamilton. Another idea, of course, is what do you do with this hole in the ground? There's this 5 acre hole in the ground that was an old gravel pit. John Lyell thought it should be filled with water and turned into a duck pond with a tea house on the side of it. That was his idea. Another one of these designers that was a runner-up, famous couple, Howard and Laurie Dunnington Grubb. Has anybody been to Gage Park? They designed it. Has anybody been on the campus of McMaster University? They had the contract to design the landscaping of the original 1930 McMaster campus in Hamilton. They did not win the competition for their designs, but they did do some interesting things, like propose a fine art museum on the Burlington Heights. It wasn't built there, but later it was built along Main Street near McMaster University, and today it's known downtown as the Art Gallery of Hamilton. They had an idea for the hole in the ground. They thought it should be an amphitheater. They thought there should be an amphitheater in Hamilton, echoing earlier ideas that you find in the literature. The winner of the competition was a company called Wilson, Bonnell and Borgström in Toronto. The principal of the company was Carl Borgström, a Swedish landscape architect, and their idea was sweeping. They wanted to decorate the entire Burlington Heights, including Dundurn Castle, and north is down on this drawing, all the way to the tip, and have a park over here at Pier 4. Actually, this is Pier 8, Pier 4 is over here. The boulevard going all the way around Hamilton Harbor. Their idea, his idea, was to put a garden in that hole in the ground. As far as we can tell, the rock garden was entirely the idea of Carl Borgström. Nobody else thought there should be a garden in that hole. He came up with the idea. And because it was a gravel pit and there was no stone there, the stone that's today in the rock garden had to be imported from the Niagara Escarpment, from quarries between 8 and 10 kilometers away. We think we know where one of them was, at Albion Falls. Another one was at King's Forest, and a third one in Waterdown. So even when you look at something as beautiful and seemingly natural as the rock garden, you can't assume what you see is the history. This competition was considered groundbreaking at the time, if you'll pardon the pun. And of course, Hamilton has always liked rubbing it in the nose of Toronto. The Toronto Star in 1929 published an article about this project and the winning design. The article was ghostwritten by Thomas Baker McQuestion, apparently. But interestingly, if you look at that date, what happened in November 1929? Stock market crash. This project predates the Great Depression. Everything was set to go, the financing was in place, the designs were done, and they were quarrying stone. And then the Great Depression hit. And what happened 2 years later, after the economics were worked out, is that the city did receive some funding from higher levels of government as a relief project, but it was after the fact. Sometimes the rock garden and these gardens on the Burlington Heights were described as a make-work project during the Depression. Only true at the very end. The rock garden was built over a 2-year period and opened in 1931-32. And the scale of it, when you see in these early photographs without the vegetation, is enormous. So think about the 10,000 tons of limestone moved to the site over a 2-year period and all put stone by stone into place in the bowl. The archives are full of wonderful photographs. Here's one from shortly after the garden opened, showing the bowl, the 5.5-acre hole in the ground, all prepared as a garden, and around it, more gardens. There were many more gardens up there on the Burlington Heights than just the rock garden in the 1930s. Here's the road. On either side of it was a strange and interesting circular parking lot that was planted up as an arboretum, with gardens at one end of it. We can take a look at how this landform has changed over time if we make use of some of these drawings and some of the photographs that are available. Here's that blueprint. I've inverted the image so it's a little bit clearer and enlarged the northern tip. There's where the rock garden is today. You see these deep gullies? Those are railroad tracks. When the railroads came through, they dug down into the Burlington Heights and created channels through which the railroads run today. So one of the first things to recognize about this landform is it's been chopped into pieces. It had a gully dug through it in the 1850s and all of these tracks for the railroads. There are other sites up and down the Burlington Heights as well where there were other gravel pits. Gravel was in huge demand. If you want to build a railroad, you need 3 things physically. You need steel, rails. You need wood for the ties to hold the rails together. And under the ties, what do you put? Gravel. So these maps are all marked from the 1850s that we found in Hamilton. Railway ballast. That's what was going out of the Burlington Heights and into the railroads across the province, or at least this area. So we can actually take a look at all the different things that were going on in the Burlington Heights by the 1930s. Take apart things like where the roads were running, where the railroads were running, where the open space was. And there could be lectures and lectures and lectures on this space, and yet today we drive past this as fast as we can. Has anybody read the book, The Fishers of Paradise by Rachel Preston? Take a look at it if you get a chance. It's really intriguing because it's not generally recognized that there was a whole community of people living on the Burlington Heights in the 1920s and a little bit earlier, down here on either side of the canal, called the Boathouse Community. And she wrote her book as a fictionalized account of one of the families that was present during their eviction by the Hamilton Board of Park Management. So again, really interesting juxtaposition of what often happens to a small community when a bigger community decides to flex its muscles. They wanted to make this into a giant park for everyone to enjoy, but to do that they had to evict the poor people who were earning a living from the wetland. In the 1930s, Hamilton bought up that land, and they decided again through this competition to create gardens in all of these all these blue spaces. Up and down the Burlington Heights, north of the canal, everything that wasn't a road or a railroad was going to be a garden. 55 acres of it. Today the rock garden is 5.5 acres. So the original design for the gardens on the Burlington Heights was 10 times the size of the rock garden. And we can take a look at aerial photographs. McMaster University's map library has a wonderful collection. And we can actually go through those aerial photographs and kind of parse the features. Work out what was where when. That War of 1812 graveyard shows up, for example. We don't recognize it today. The shape of the Burlington Heights has been changed completely over the past 50 years by changes primarily to the road. This is the way York Boulevard looked in 1932. So driving down from the south, you would enter one of Canada's first roundabouts. And this is Longwood Road, running right down to the Shore of Goods Paradise Marsh, across the canal at what was called the low-level bridge, and on towards Westdale. They had to build that because they had to close the high-level bridge, or the high-level area, to build the new bridge. And it was too important a thoroughfare to simply close for 2 years while they built the bridge. So they built the low-level bridge, and that, of course, today is under the 403. And this year, the MTO is removing the last traces of those historical bridges. in the reconstruction of the 403. The location and the width of York Boulevard has changed over time. But what I find fascinating about this site is that there were gardens. Every place there wasn't a road, there was a garden. It was all part of Borgstrom's original design. Again, this is a few years later. You can see the trees have grown up in the gardens. This is where the graveyard is. This is a site called the Memorial Garden, which I'll speak about in a minute. And of course, all of this was washed aside in the 1970s when the road was changed. Each of these designers had a different idea for what to do with these gardens. This is Dunnington Grubbs. Very formal, a lot of driving pathways up and down the sides of Cootes Paradise Marsh. John Lyle, again, he had ideas which can only be described appropriately as Brobdingnagian. It means huge, outsized, out of all proportion. Up and down the Burlington Heights, he wanted to build driveways and roads and a marina either side. Ignoring the fact, of course, that Cootes Paradise Marsh is about 1 meter thick. The Memorial Garden site is really evocative, though, and if you're interested in history, it's worth a wander sometime. This is Carl Borgstrom's original design for the site from 1930. That red dot is where the stone is today, marking the historic graves. There were buildings and facilities that were never built. There's Longwood Road. There were terraced gardens that were built. Immediately to the south of that, they're all gone now. Because in 1963, when they built the 403, they put an off-ramp right through the gardens. To the north, there is a very evocative site called the Memorial Garden, which was all RBG property. It was abandoned in 1974 as an active garden. We still own and maintain the site as best we can. But because there's simply no way to operate it as a garden that people can visit on a regular basis, it was decided in the 70s to shut it down. I've been looking and looking for good aerial photographs of the site in color from the early 60s. I stumbled on this postcard online. So here's Hamilton Harbor, quite obviously. Here's the other side of the harbor before a lot of the development took place. Pier 4 Park sits right in here, for example. Here's York Road, the bridge. Here is the Soldiers' Graveyard site. And this is before the construction of the Shidok Expressway or Highway 403. And here is the Memorial Garden, which had a reflecting pool and a lot of columnar cedars. And here are all of the other gardens and terraces up and down the length of the Burlington Heights. In 1963, when they built the Shidok Expressway, they put the off-ramp straight through all those gardens. I love this postcard too. I won't try to read the whole thing, but it's charming. It's from a mother to her daughter at a summer camp. And it says something like, at the very last line, "Don't be too bold in the water." So we see today a changed landscape, and we can tell all these amazing stories about it. And if we go into the history, if we go into the archives, we can pull things out like the original drawings and the accounts of people that came up with the ideas. A lot of it, though, is still shadowy. For example, the rock garden, we've never seen a color photograph of the rock garden in its early years. It was built before Kodachrome or before Ektachrome. But interestingly, we do have some colorized black and white photographs. So when the rock garden was built, this is how it looked. We can talk about all the stone, but it was actually a rock garden. It was covered with beautiful alpine plants. This is another photograph that's been hand-tinted. People were used to seeing it this way by the 1950s. The trees had grown up and had changed the microclimate in the garden so it could no longer be an alpine garden. And RBG started planting a lot of tulips there. But by this century, there were a whole lot of good reasons to change, and sometimes I do a whole talk on the rock garden. But you may know that we did a major project on the rock garden in the last 3 years. There's a new visitor center out there, which is fantastic. And although it's changed, we're extremely proud now of this renewed rock garden. The stonework along the edges have been retained and respected. A lot of it's been repaired. But there's a new garden philosophy in the garden itself. We're no longer planting tulips every year. Now we have permaculture. We have beautiful plants that live there year-round, change over the seasons, and we're starting to figure out how to program the garden for people to enjoy it in the winter. Because that's a huge challenge for a garden. Up here, what do? Run a huge institution 6 months of the year. We want people to be able to enjoy the outdoors, whether they're in the natural areas or in a garden year-round. Now we can extend this process to all of the different areas of Royal Botanical Gardens and in any landscape at all. You could ask the same questions about For example, McMaster's Industrial Park. What were the buildings that were here before? What were the industries that were here in the 19th and 20th century? Where did they all come from? Where did they go? What's their economic and social history? It's all part of this fascinating cultural geography story. Where we are located, our offices at RBG, my little office sits right in there, at RBG Center. Some of you may know, for example, that in the 19th century this was a farm owned by a gentleman named William Hendry. William Hendry was a leading industrialist in the city of Hamilton. He had a cartage company and a monopoly on moving cargo to and from railroad stations from Chicago to Montreal. And to have a cartage company in the 19th century, you needed something warm that smells really nice. Horses. You had to have draft horses. Hello. You had to have draft horses. And he bred them at this farm. As a hobby, he bred racehorses. And so some of you might know too that in RBG Center, or RBG across the street in what we call Henry Park, there's a set of gates which are dedicated to the memory of the family. They were part of a bequest. They were not the gates to the farm. They're an architectural folly. But behind the gates, there is a headstone to one of his horses, Martimus. Martimus won so much money that William Hendry gave a bunch of it to the city of Hamilton and endowed the Martimus wing in Hamilton General Hospital. Now, gardens are really interesting because they are by nature a place of change and yet stability. They do generate this sense of place if you spend time with them. They change throughout the year and they change over time. Our Rose Garden was opened in 1967 as a centennial project, and like the Rock Garden, by the 20th century it was showing some real signs of need of work. We were even having trouble keeping the big blocks of monoculture roses alive. They were mid-20th century rose cultivars. A lot of them required an awful lot of life support and chemicals to keep going. So we took a bold step last year and we dug it all out. And we worked with a consultant from Maine named Peter Kakowski, who's published whole books on roses that don't need chemicals. They're out there. And so he designed the plantings. We worked with local architects to redesign the garden and the pathway. Last year, we jumped into it with both feet flying and had to remove all the topsoil. Because there's something I didn't know about, because I'm a turtle biologist. Apparently, if you have roses growing in one place for a very, very long time, you can't place roses back in the ground again. There's a toxicity in the soil. So we pulled the soil out. We put in brand new walkways. The walkways are now kind of organic and curved and very broad, wheelchair accessible. They're lovely spaces. Our education department has developed a whole new story of roses educational experience along the garden. The roses were planted as well as a lot of companion plants. There's more than roses in that garden now. And the intention is that that's healthy for the garden itself to have more than one species in there. But it also makes it look more beautiful throughout the year. The roses when it stopped blooming, the companion plants, of course now we're getting to frost, will stop as well. But the whole idea of this garden is to emphasize that you don't need high chemical input to have roses, and you can tell stories based on what you're showing people. So we can actually tell the story of the explorer roses, because the John Cabot rose is in there. And where did they come from? They came from the Central Experimental Farm in Ottawa, because in the 1960s, Agriculture Canada bred roses. We have Canada's largest collection of nursery trade catalogs at RBG, and we can get into the deep history of where these things came from. So to sum up, Royal Botanical Gardens really is a curious place. There's all these things going on. There's history. There's prior history. We're trying to understand what all of our properties were before they were gardens, and then how the gardens got to be where they are today. Les Laking, our director for many years, wrote to try to clarify what we are, that Royal Botanical Gardens puts nature's beauty on display, but it isn't a park system. It teaches, but it isn't a school. It protects and preserves forest and marsh, but it isn't a conservation authority. It collects and propagates botanical knowledge and plant life, but it's not a library, museum, or laboratory. It is the sum of all of these things, and more than the sum. In other words, it's many things to many different people. Above all, though, it's a place. And again, it's been such a joy working there and working with our volunteers. We have over 1,000 volunteers at RBG now. People have been coming to this place for generations, to visit, to enjoy, to love it, and to help bring something really together. And that personal connection with people generates that sense of place. American author Ken Ryden wrote, "The place has become a shaping partner in our lives. We partially define ourselves in its terms, and it carries the emotional charge of a family member or any other influential human agent." So when someone talks about how replaceable land is, and you can just buy some over here and sell some over there, I look at that with a little bit of skepticism. Because I think we are creatures that are happiest when we know where our sense of place is, where we connect to our neighbors, the things around us, not necessarily in a restrictive way, but in a way that tells us who we are and the stories we can elaborate and tell beyond that. The famous author Lawrence Durrell, the brother of conservationist Jerry Durrell, wrote this in his novel Justine. "We are the children of our landscape. It dictates behavior and even thought in the measure to which we are responsive to it." Thank you very much.